anyway, it starts off when I was born. So in 1967, I was born in the Crown Street Women's Hospital in Sydney, and about 3 weeks later I was adopted by a wonderful, loving couple who had tried unsuccessfully for 12 years to conceive their own biological children, but without success. A couple of years later they adopted another little girl, my sister Kerry, and the two of us grew up in suburban Sydney in a fairly unremarkable way, just a normal nuclear family, I guess, or adopted nuclear family. The adoption thing wasn't really an issue growing up. We just knew we were adopted. Mum had told us pretty early on, written a little book all about it, and that was our story. And then it wasn't until I was in a Year 9 science class that things changed a little bit for me. The teacher at the time was giving an introductory lesson on inheritance and genetics, and he set us a little homework task. He made us go home and quiz our parents and our siblings and ask and get all this information about things like eye colour and whether or not you've got a widow's peak and whether you can roll your tongue and all that sort of stuff. And so being a little, good student, even back then in Year 9, I went home and I diligently filled out the form and I brought it back in, and the next day he's up there in front of the blackboard writing everybody's results up on the board, and he gets to me and he starts scribing my answers, and he looks at me kind of oddly, and then he goes, "Are you sure you didn't make this up?" And I was a bit mortified because I was being accused of not doing my homework, and I always did. And I went, "No, I'm adopted." Well, he picked up his duster and he just rubbed off all of my results. And I didn't see that coming at all. And I was shocked and I was embarrassed and I felt a little bit, why is this happening? And I was a bit angry and a bit confused about the whole situation. And it wasn't until a few lessons later where I actually started to appreciate that there was a biological consequence to being adopted. And so it was a bit of a pivotal moment because it just was a natural curiosity that I wanted to follow, and I ended up spending 10 years in the field of genetics research after school finished, and so I sort of went down this path, and I'd be in the lab extracting DNA and from various creatures and wondering where my DNA had come from, and wondering what secrets it held and all sorts of stuff. But my parents were still alive and I didn't really want to kind of upset them and go looking prematurely. So in 1996 though, curiosity got the better of me, and I was working in the lab by myself at Ames, and I had the radio in the background, and Triple J were interviewing a number of adoptees like myself. And some of them had some great stories about reunions and meeting up with their biological parents and all sorts of stuff. But the interviewer was really keen on talking to some of the adoptive mums. So the next day, there were a number of women that he spoke to, and they retold their story of what it was like going through that process. And I guess I'd always thought that it was something that these women went into willingly, where they were young, they weren't ready to settle down, they weren't married, and they certainly weren't wanting to become mothers at that point in their life, so they gave up their babies. What I didn't realise is that often they were forced to do that. Some of them were drugged, made to sign paperwork, they weren't allowed to touch their babies. The stories were quite harrowing and affected me deeply, and it really made me wonder whether my own biological mother had gone through the same process. I'd always held her in the highest opinion because she put my welfare before her own. And so I kind of felt like, well, if she's out there and she's always worried about me, I should perhaps look for her. So I applied for my birth certificate, and I found that her name was Jean Elizabeth McLeod and that she was 17 when she had me, so she was young. She was born in the Tweed Valley, just far northern New South Wales. But coincidentally, her address at the time of the adoption was in the little Sydney suburb of Panania, which is where I'd grown up. So that was kind of a little bit uncanny. So then I started looking through births, deaths and marriages to see if there was any record of her. And I came across my first brick wall. There was nothing. There was nothing. So I kind of went, well, maybe she had me under a false name. Fast forward to 2009, my adoptive mum had recently passed away and my sister's marriage had failed, and she was going through a bit of a tough time and feeling a bit lost. And she'd been watching this show on TV called Find My Family, where they reunite adoptees with their biological parents. And she rang me and she said, I'd love to go looking for my biological mum. Would you be prepared to look with me? Now, we're not biological sisters, so we were looking for two separate people. But I said, well, I've already tried once and I didn't find anything, but I'm sure this show is better resourced and can look a bit harder. So absolutely, signed the paperwork, sat back and waited. Another brick wall. But they did give me all of my original adoption paperwork, which was fascinating. So I sat there and I pored over it, and it had, you know, some details about height and eye colour and what my information about my parents and a little bit of information about my father. And it turns out my mum was born her parents were cane farmers, and my biological father, Gary, was a cane cutter. So lots of questions, but no real answers. I didn't know how much of it was true, whether she'd changed her name or what. And I just kind of went, oh, well, I've got something, but I haven't really got much. But as the years ticked by, I thought, well, chance of actually finding or meeting this person might not happen. So I just kind of got on with life until last December, and I was sitting there scrolling through Facebook, and these Ancestry.com ads kept popping up on my Facebook feed. And a lady from work had recently had a bit of success, not that she was adopted, but she, you know, was putting together her family tree with it. So I thought, I should give it a shot, you know. So I ordered a kit and spat in the little tube and sent it off to the States and waited for 6 weeks, and I got it back, got the results back in an email, and they said, well, if I really didn't think I would get much out of it, apart from confirmation that perhaps my ancestry was Scottish, which McLeod seemed to indicate. Well, that part was correct, and then it said, see who you're related to. So I've clicked on the button, and this big screen rocks up with all these names, but the top hit had 24% of DNA in common with me. And that's a very, very, very close relative. And I was like, whew. Anyway, so this lady's name was Perry Ann Snodgrass, and I'm going, oh, that's a bit of an odd name. And a friend was over for dinner, and as soon as I told her the story, and as soon as I no longer said Perry Ann Snodgrass, and she's got her phone out and she's Googling this woman, and she's like trying to find out all this information about this poor old lady. And it turned out that she was a writer and a family historian and a painter. So she had this really rich history, and we looked up the books that she'd written, and she'd written books about her own family, and we knew her onto something big. The synopsis of her second book was set on a cane farm in the Tweed Valley, and I was like, oh, and I still get goosebumps when I think about it. And remarkably, the catchphrase on the front of the book was, all families have secrets, and ours was no different. And I was the secret they didn't even know about at that stage. So I'm like, I've penned an introductory email to this lady because I could send her an email through the Ancestry app, and I sort of waited, and she got in touch with me, and she said, oh yes, that is a very, very close match. And she said, I have a brother and a sister. I'll ask them the difficult questions in a very sensitive way, and I will definitely get back to you. And then I was at work one day and I got an email from her, and it was the most beautiful message. Welcome to the family. I'm your aunt, and my brother is your biological father. And he's very excited and wants to get in touch. So I called him the next day, and we had a good long chat, and he was pretty keen on kind of answering those tricky questions like, well, how did this come to be? Because he had no idea that I existed. So he had been invited by, he was 21 at the time, and he'd been invited for a few drinks with his boss at the Townsville pub, and his boss's friends arrived in tow with this lovely young Jean McLeod, and the two of them got chatting and got friendly, and then someone suggested that Jim should give her a lift home in his little sports car, and they obviously didn't take the most direct route home. And in my father's own words, he said, probably not the star-crossed love that you imagined, but you know, that's how he remembers it. So I had half of the puzzle, but I needed more, and I really wanted to meet these people, of course. So I booked a flight to Brisbane, and in the meantime he was trying to help me to find who this Jean McLeod was. So he came up with this fellow's name and contact, which he thought was her ex-husband. I didn't really feel right about contacting that man directly because I didn't know whether she'd ever told him about me, and I didn't know if they'd separated amicably. So I ended up Facebook stalking him and finding another relative that actually had a mutual friend with me. Long story short, she found Jean on my behalf. Jean was over the moon, sent through a text message with phone number, and I made the phone call. And so I'm sitting on my back deck, the phone's ringing, and yeah, it was very emotional. So we chatted for a bit, and then she said, oh, how did you come to find me? And I said, oh, DNA. And I said, look, you know, I'd done all these searches previously, but didn't find anything. So, and she said, and I said, so, but then I did this DNA test, Ancestry. I had a match with this Perry Ann, and bingo, she was my aunt, and her brother was my father. And she goes, oh, so you've met Gary? And I went, his name's not Gary. And I was acutely aware that her husband was listening to this whole thing unfold. And where do you go from there? Like, I had nothing. So there was this long silence. And she's going, oh, that can't be. And I said, his name's Jim Salmon. And there was more silence. And she said, and I said eventually, do you know a Jim Salmon? And she said, oh, well, yes. Anyway, there was a logical explanation behind the whole thing, and at the end of the day, she was absolutely over the moon that it wasn't Gary and it was Jim. So of course the next step was to meet them all. And so I already had the flights booked, and she had 3 days' notice. So I've got on the plane, flown down to Brisbane. Jim and his wife picked me up from Brisbane. They drove me down to the area, had lunch, we went to meet Perry, and we had dinner together, and it was just wonderful. And there was wine and conversation, and we just kept staring at each other, you know, like looking at all those little similarities that I'd always been denied, you know, and it was just I still pinch myself, you know, it was very surreal. So Jean very kindly said, invite them to our place for lunch the next day. And I've gone, okay. So it was about a 20-minute drive, and oh my God, the butterflies were just, felt like they were about that big in my stomach. I could barely speak, and I'm rarely lost for words. Anyway, we got to the door, and I was armed with my little bunch of flowers, and when I gave her that first hug, she said, I've waited 53 years for this hug. I was never allowed to touch you in the hospital. I still just can't believe that the irony of the whole thing. So the adoption led to my fascination with genetics, which in turn led me back to those beautiful adoptive people, and just a whole new world, a whole new beginning. So it was a really nice story, and thanks for letting me share it.